The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees lining Cedar Street as 68-year-old Margaret Wilson slowly made her way down the cracked sidewalk. Her arthritis was particularly bad that morning, but she'd run out of her heart medication and needed to visit Johnson's pharmacy before it closed. The walk that once took her 15 minutes now required nearly twice that time, each step a careful negotiation between determination and pain. Margaret had lived in this neighborhood for over 4 decades, watching it transform from a vibrant community hub to an area struggling with neglect and rising tensions. Still, she knew every shop owner by name, attended every community meeting, and refused to let fear keep her confined to her small but tidy home. Her daughter Sarah, a prominent civil rights attorney in Atlanta, often urged her to move closer to her, but Margaret stood firm. "This is my home," she'd always say, "and I won't be chased away." The familiar bell above Johnson's pharmacy door chimed as Margaret stepped inside, the air conditioning providing welcome relief from the humid September afternoon. Tom Johnson, whose father had opened the pharmacy 50 years ago, looked up from his computer with concern. "Mrs. Wilson, you're not looking too good today. Maybe I should call Sarah to come pick you up?" Margaret waved away his worry with a gentle smile. "Now, Tom, don't you start fussing like my daughter. I just need my refill, and I'll be on my way." She handed over her prescription slip, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her wallet. That's when the commotion started outside. Through the storefront window, Margaret could see Officer James Reeves stepping out of his patrol car. She'd seen him around the neighborhood before, a relatively new transfer to the precinct with a reputation for being overzealous in his duties. The sight of him made her nervous, but she pushed the feeling aside. She'd done nothing wrong. As Margaret left the pharmacy, prescription bag clutched in her hand, Officer Reeves was already approaching her with quick, purposeful strides. "Ma'am, I need to see what's in that bag," he demanded, his hand resting on his belt in what she recognized as an intimidation tactic. "Officer, these are just my heart medications," Margaret explained calmly, though her chest tightened with anxiety. "You can ask Tom inside, he just filled the prescription." She gestured toward the pharmacy, where Tom was now watching the interaction with growing concern. What happened next would be captured by multiple cell phones and security cameras, sparking outrage across social media platforms and news outlets nationwide. Officer Reeves, ignoring Margaret's explanation and Tom's attempts to intervene, grabbed the elderly woman's arm roughly. Margaret, startled by the sudden movement, lost her balance and dropped her prescription bag, pills scattering across the sidewalk. "Stop resisting," Reeves shouted, though Margaret was doing nothing of the sort. The absurdity of the situation might have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. Here she was, a grandmother who volunteered at the local library and baked cookies for church fundraisers, being treated like a dangerous criminal. In Atlanta, Sarah Wilson was in the middle of preparing for a major civil rights case when her phone started buzzing with messages. The first text came from Mrs. Johnson, Tom's wife. "Sarah, call me ASAP. It's about your mother." Then came the video links, first one, then dozens, showing her mother, her strong, dignified mother, being manhandled by a police officer outside Johnson's pharmacy. Sarah's hands shook as she watched the footage. Her mother's voice, usually so steady, trembled as she tried to explain about her medication. The officer's aggressive stance, his complete dismissal of an elderly woman's dignity, the gathering crowd's horrified reactions. It was all there in high definition, a perfect illustration of everything she'd been fighting against in her legal career. But what the officer couldn't have known as he twisted Margaret's arm behind her back was that he wasn't just dealing with any elderly woman from the neighborhood. He had no idea that her daughter had spent the last 15 years building one of the most successful civil rights law practices in the Southeast. He couldn't have known that Sarah Wilson had just won a landmark case against police brutality the previous month, or that she had a network of the country's top civil rights attorneys on speed dial. As Margaret sat in the back of the police car, her wrists aching from the handcuffs, she closed her eyes and thought of her late husband. James Wilson had been one of the first black police officers in their precinct, serving with honor for 30 years. He'd always told their daughter that change had to come from both outside and within the system. Looking at Officer Reeves through the patrol car's partition, Margaret couldn't help but wonder what James would say about how little some things had changed. The story of what happened that September afternoon outside Johnson's pharmacy would soon explode across national headlines. But the real story, the one about justice, accountability, and a daughter's fierce determination to protect her mother's dignity, was just beginning. What Officer James Reeves set in motion that day would spark a chain of events that would reshape not just one police department, but become a catalyst for change in law enforcement practices across the state. As Sarah Wilson boarded the first flight from Atlanta to her hometown, her mother's case file already taking shape in her mind, she had no idea that this incident would become one of the most significant cases of her career. But one thing was certain: Officer Reeves was about to learn a powerful lesson about consequences, justice, and the strength of a family's bond. The holding cell at the precinct was cold, and Margaret Wilson couldn't stop shivering. Her arthritis had flared up badly from the rough handling, and the thin blanket provided offered little comfort. Through the small window in her cell, she could see officers walking past, some averting their eyes, others whispering among themselves. A few of the veteran officers recognized her. After all, her husband James had trained many of them before his passing 5 years ago. Officer Patricia Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the force, posed outside Margaret's cell, her face etched with concern. She worked with James Wilson during his final years on the force and had attended his funeral. "Mrs. Wilson," she said softly, approaching the cell, "I've called Captain Richards. He's on his way in from home." She paused, choosing her words carefully. What Officer Reeves did, it's not what your husband stood for. Meanwhile, Sarah Wilson's Uber from the airport cut through evening traffic like a knife. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the video went viral. CNN wanted a statement. The NAACP was mobilizing their legal team. Her law partner had already filed an emergency motion for her mother's immediate release. But what kept playing in Sarah's mind was the last conversation she'd had with her father, just days before his unexpected heart attack. "Baby girl," he'd said, sitting in his favorite armchair, still in his uniform after his final shift before retirement. "The badge doesn't make the officer, the heart does." He'd spent his career trying to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, establishing youth outreach programs and diversity initiatives that became models for departments across the country. Now, 5 years after his death, Sarah watched as his legacy was being trampled by officers like James Reeves. Back at the precinct, Captain David Richards arrived looking like he aged 10 years in a single afternoon. He'd known this day was coming. Reeves had been a problem since his transfer from a smaller department 6 months ago. Multiple complaints about excessive force, a pattern of targeting minority residents, and a stubborn resistance to any form of correction. The captain had been building a case for dismissal, but bureaucracy and the police union had slowed the process. "Get Mrs. Wilson process-stabbed immediately," Richards ordered, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had earned him respect throughout his 30-year career. "And somebody find me Officer Reeves." But Reeves had already left the precinct, claiming a family emergency shortly after booking Margaret. His dashcam footage, which should have recorded the entire incident, was mysteriously corrupted, a detail that would later become crucial to the investigation. Tom Johnson from the pharmacy had already uploaded his security camera footage to multiple social media platforms. The video showed the entire interaction in crystal clear detail: Margaret's careful explanation about her medication, Reeves's aggressive approach, and most damning of all, his deliberate interference when other officers initially tried to intervene. The footage had reached over 2 million views in just 3 hours, with hashtags demanding justice flooding social media. As Sarah's Uber pulled up to the precinct, she spotted a growing crowd of community members gathering outside. Many held signs bearing her mother's photo, alongside pictures of her father in his dress uniform. The contrast was striking. James Wilson's proud smile and his police blues next to images of his wife being roughed up by an officer who'd sworn the same oath to protect and serve. Inside, Sarah found her mother being released, Officer Martinez gently helping her gather her belongings. Margaret looked smaller somehow, her usual dignified posture diminished by the ordeal, but her eyes lit up at the sight of her daughter. "I knew you'd come," she said softly, pulling Sarah into a hug that smelled of home and childhood memories. What happened next would become a turning point in the community's relationship with law enforcement. As Margaret and Sarah emerged from the precinct, the crowd fell silent. Then, one by one, people began to step forward, sharing their own stories of encounters with Officer Reeves. A teenager described being harassed while walking home from basketball practice. An elderly man spoke about his grandson being roughed up during a routine traffic stop. A local business owner recalled Reeves demanding to search her store without a warrant. A pattern emerged, one that Sarah's trained legal mind immediately recognized as systematic targeting and abuse of power. But it was more than just a legal case now. This was personal, a direct assault on everything her father had worked to build, everything her mother had supported through decades of community service. Captain Richards watched from his office window as the crowd grew. He thought about James Wilson, remembered the conversations they'd had about changing the system from within. On his desk lay Reeves's personnel file, thick with incident reports and civilian complaints. Next to it sat a framed photo from his academy graduation, showing a young David Richards standing proudly beside Officer James Wilson, his training officer and mentor. As the evening news vans began arriving outside the precinct, Sarah held her mother's hand tightly, knowing that their next steps would ripple far beyond their community. The system that had allowed Officer Reeves to operate with impunity was about to face a reckoning, but the path to justice would require more than just legal action. It would demand a fundamental re-examination of how power was wielded and accountability enforced. Unknown to everyone gathered outside the precinct, Officer Reeves wasn't at home dealing with a family emergency. He was in a bar 2 counties over, watching the growing media coverage with increasing panic. His phone buzzed with a text from a fellow officer. Wilson's daughter isn't just any lawyer. She's the lawyer, the one who took down the Memphis PD last year. Reeves ordered another drink, his hands shaking slightly as he realized the full implications of his actions were just beginning to unfold. 3 days after Margaret Wilson's arrest, the city was a powder keg of tension and revelations. Sarah had set up a temporary command center in her childhood home's living room. Legal papers spread across the coffee table where her father used to read his evening newspaper. Her mother sat in her favorite armchair, fielding calls from national media outlets while community members streamed in and out of the house, bringing casseroles and sharing stories. "There's something you need to see," said Marcus Jenkins, a young tech-savvy activist who'd been helping Sarah compile evidence. He pulled up security footage from other businesses along Cedar Street, showing Officer Reeves's patrol patterns over the past 6 months. The video compilation revealed a disturbing trend. Reeves had been systematically targeting elderly residents in predominantly black neighborhoods, often following them from banks or pharmacies. Margaret watched the footage with growing anger, recognizing many of the faces. "That's Mrs. Thompson from my church chore," she said, pointing to one clip. "She stopped coming to evening services 2 months ago, said she didn't feel safe walking home anymore. We all thought she was just being cautious." Meanwhile, across town at the police union headquarters, a heated debate was unfolding. Union Representative Mike Donovan stood at the front of a packed room, facing dozens of officers. "We have to stand by our brother in blue," he insisted, but his words were met with unprecedented resistance. Officer Patricia Martinez stood up, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "I didn't put on this badge to protect police," she declared. "James Wilson trained half the people in this room. He taught us that respect and dignity weren't optional parts of the job, they were the job." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, growing stronger as more officers found their courage to speak up. At the precinct, Captain Richards was facing his own crisis of conscience. Internal Affairs had finally sent over Reeves's complete transfer records, and what he found made his blood run cold. 3 departments in 5 years, each transfer following similar patterns of misconduct complaints. The records had been deliberately obscured, buried under layers of bureaucratic paperwork and interdepartmental politics. Sarah was reviewing these same records in her mother's kitchen when she received an unexpected call. "Ms. Wilson," a nervous voice said, "I worked with Officer Reeves at his last precinct. There's something you need to know about what happened in Springfield." The caller, a junior officer who'd witnessed Reeves's behavior firsthand, had been silenced by threats to his career. Now, watching the Wilson case unfold on national news, he couldn't stay quiet any longer. As Sarah took notes, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and vindication, Margaret was hosting an impromptu gathering in their backyard. Dozens of community members, many of whom had their own stories about Reeves, had come together to support each other and plan their response. Among them was Tom Johnson from the pharmacy, who brought all his security footage from the past 6 months. "Look at this," Tom said, pulling up a video on his laptop. 2 weeks before Mrs. Wilson's arrest, Reeves was parked outside my store for 3 hours, watching customers come and go. He'd only approached certain people, all elderly, all black. It wasn't random. None of this was random. The evidence was mounting, but so was the pressure to maintain the status quo. Anonymous threats began appearing on Sarah's law firm's social media pages. Margaret's garden was vandalized one night, her beloved rose bushes torn up. Roses her husband had planted 20 years ago. But for every act of intimidation, the community responded with twice as much support. Officer Reeves, meanwhile, had finally surfaced, holding a press conference with his own legal team. They painted a picture of a dedicated officer doing his job, claiming Margaret had been combative and uncooperative. But their carefully constructed narrative began to crumble when body camera footage from other officers at the scene was leaked online, showing Margaret's calm demeanor and Reeves's unprovoked aggression. The case was becoming bigger than just one incident or one officer. It was exposing decades of systemic issues, patterns of behavior that had been ignored or actively covered up. Sarah found herself at the center of not just a legal battle, but a movement for change that her father had dreamed of sparking. Late one evening, as mother and daughter sat on their front porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Margaret broke their contemplative silence. "Your father used to say that change doesn't come from making noise, it comes from making sense," she said, reaching for Sarah's hand. He believed that true justice requires both courage and compassion. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. More footage had surfaced, this time from a retired officer's personal camera. The video showed Reeves in a private conversation with other officers weeks before Margaret's arrest, discussing his cleanup operation in the neighborhood. His words, caught on camera, would shock even his staunchest defenders and add a disturbing new dimension to the case. As Sarah clicked the video link, neither she nor Margaret could have anticipated how their fight for justice was about to expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond their small community, threatening to shake the very foundation of law enforcement in their state. The question was no longer just about one officer's actions, but about who had enabled and protected him, and why. 1 week before the scheduled police commission hearing, Sarah Wilson sat in her temporary office at the community center, surrounded by stacks of evidence and testimonies. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the latest video Marcus had uncovered, footage that would change everything. The clip showed Officer Reeves in a series of meetings with property developers who had been eyeing the neighborhood for months. Suddenly, the pattern of harassment targeting elderly residents made a chilling kind of sense. "Mom, you need to see this," Sarah called out to Margaret, who was organizing a community meeting in the next room. Her mother walked over slowly, still dealing with lingering pain from her arrest. As they watched the footage together, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The cleanup operation Reeves had mentioned wasn't just about harassment. It was about forcing longtime residents out of their homes. Meanwhile, across town, Captain Richard sat in his office, staring at a manila envelope that had just arrived on his desk. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, showing Reeves meeting with high-ranking city officials and real estate developers over the past year. Among them was Deputy Chief Anderson, Richard's direct superior and the man in charge of internal investigations. The captain's heart sank as he realized the depth of the corruption he was facing. "David, we need to talk," Officer Martinez said from his doorway. She'd been doing her own digging, connecting with officers from Reeves's previous departments. "It's worse than we thought. The pattern goes back years, and it's not just Reeves. There's a whole network of officers working with developers in different cities. They target vulnerable communities, create an atmosphere of fear, and then the developers swoop in to buy properties at rock-bottom prices." At the community center, the evening meeting was packed. Margaret stood at the podium, her voice strong despite her fatigue. "They thought we were easy targets," she declared to the crowd. "They saw our gray hair and assumed we were weak. But they forgot something important. We built this community. We survived segregation, we survived redlining, and we're not about to let corruption and greed drive us from our homes." The room erupted in applause. The celebration was short-lived. Sarah's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Marcus. Security cameras had caught two men breaking into their evidence storage room at the law office. Nothing was taken, but a clear message had been left. A photo of Margaret and Sarah's house with a red X marked across it. Officer Martinez, watching the community meeting from the back of the room, noticed something odd. A man she didn't recognize was taking photos of the attendees. When their eyes met, he quickly slipped out the side door. She followed him to the parking lot just in time to see him getting into a car, with Deputy Chief Anderson in the driver's seat. Back at the Wilson home, Sarah was preparing for bed when her phone rang. The caller's voice was distorted, but the message was clear. Drop the case, or the next video that goes viral won't be about police brutality. It'll be about a tragic accident involving your mother. Before she could respond, the line went dead. Margaret found her daughter sitting in the dark kitchen, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. They threatened you, didn't they? She asked softly. Sarah nodded, fighting back tears. Margaret pulled up a chair beside her daughter. Your father used to say that the scariest moments are the ones right before victory. That's when they fight hardest, because they know they're about to lose. Just then, Captain Richards's number flashed on Sarah's phone. His voice was urgent. Ms. Wilson, I'm sending a patrol car to your house right now. We just intercepted some communications. They're not waiting for the hearing. They're planning something for tomorrow morning. As if on cue, they heard cars pulling up outside. Sarah peeked through the curtains to see several unmarked vehicles parking along their street. In the darkness, she could make out familiar faces. Officers she'd seen at the precinct, but not in uniform. They were moving with purpose, taking positions around the house. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Tom Johnson. Just saw Reeves at the pharmacy. He's back in town, and he's not alone. Attached was a security camera photo showing Reeves with Deputy Chief Anderson and several men in expensive suits, the same developers from the earlier footage. Sarah's mind raced as she processed everything. The hearing wasn't for another week, but their opponents were making their move now. They had evidence that could expose not just one corrupt officer, but an entire network of police and city officials working with developers to systematically displace vulnerable residents. Officer Martinez's voice crackled over Sarah's phone. Don't react to what I'm about to tell you, but you're surrounded. They've got people at every exit, but we got eyes on them too, officers who still believe in what your father stood for. Whatever happens in the next few hours will determine everything. As mother and daughter sat in their kitchen, watching shadows move across their windows, they could hear car doors slamming and muffled voices outside. The confrontation they'd been building toward was no longer a week away. It was happening now, in the darkness of their own home, with the whole community's future hanging in the balance. Margaret reached for her daughter's hand, her grip firm despite her age. Your father always said that justice is like the sunrise. You can try to stop it, but it's coming anyway. She stood up, straightening her shoulders with the same dignity she'd shown outside Johnson's pharmacy. Well, baby girl, it looks like we're about to bring the dawn. The red and blue lights of police cruisers painted the pre-dawn streets in shifting shadows as Captain Richards pulled up to the Wilson house. He'd made a decision that would either end his career or save it. He'd called in the FBI. Months of building evidence against corruption in his own department had culminated in this moment. Inside, Sarah and Margaret sat in their living room, surrounded by Officer Martinez and a small group of trusted officers who'd chosen to stand with them. The evidence was spread across their coffee table: videos, photographs, financial records, and testimonies that revealed a pattern of corruption spanning multiple cities. They're moving, Martinez whispered, watching through the window as dark figures approached the house. But before they could reach the front porch, floodlights suddenly illuminated the entire street. FBI agents emerged from their hidden positions, their voices cutting through the night air with commands to freeze. Deputy Chief Anderson, caught in the open, reached for his weapon but found himself surrounded. Officer Reeves, attempting to flee through the backyard, ran straight into a team of federal agents who'd been waiting in position. The developers who'd orchestrated the whole scheme were caught in their cars, their phones and laptops already being confiscated as evidence. But the real surprise came from an unexpected source. As the arrests were being made, Tom Johnson from the pharmacy emerged from his car, removing what looked like a small camera from his tie. I've been working with the FBI for the past 3 months, he revealed to a stunned Sarah and Margaret. After I saw what they did to Mrs. Wilson, I reached out to some old contacts from my previous life as a federal investigator. The morning news helicopters arrived just in time to capture the parade of corrupt officials being led away in handcuffs. But they'd also captured something else: hundreds of community members emerging from their homes, gathering in the street to witness justice being served. Many were holding up their phones, live streaming the moment to millions of viewers across the country. Captain Richards approached Margaret and Sarah on their porch, his face showing both relief and regret. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "your husband would be proud of what happened here today. We found evidence that this same scheme has been operating in cities across the country, targeting elderly residents, using corrupt officers to intimidate them, then buying up properties for pennies on the dollar." As the sun rose over the neighborhood, Margaret stood on her porch, addressing the gathered crowd and the news cameras. "My husband spent his life believing that good police officers and their communities could work together for justice. Today proved him right." She reached for Sarah's hand, squeezing it tightly. "But our work isn't done." The twist that no one saw coming was revealed in the following days. The FBI investigation had uncovered a nationwide network of corruption, but it also revealed something else. James Wilson, Margaret's late husband, had been collecting evidence of this scheme before his death. His heart attack 5 years ago hadn't been natural. Traces of a rarely detected poison were found in his tissue samples when they were re-examined. Sarah's voice shook as she held a press conference a week later. "My father didn't die of natural causes," she announced to a stunned audience. "He was murdered because he was close to exposing this corruption. But he left behind a trail of evidence that he knew we'd eventually find. Even in death, he was working to protect his community." The story exploded across national media. What had started as one incident of police brutality against an elderly woman had exposed a massive criminal enterprise involving corrupt officers, city officials, and real estate developers across multiple states. The investigation would eventually lead to hundreds of arrests and the return of millions of dollars in property to displaced residents. 3 months later, Margaret Wilson sat in her garden, tending to new rose bushes planted by community members to replace the ones that had been destroyed. The neighborhood had changed, but not in the way the corrupt developers had intended. Instead of being driven out, the community had grown stronger, more unified. Sarah had established a legal clinic in the community center, helping other neighborhoods fight similar battles. Officer Martinez had been promoted to captain, replacing Richards, who'd chosen to retire after ensuring the department's cleanup was complete. And Tom Johnson's pharmacy had become a symbol of community resistance, with people coming from miles around just to thank him for his role in exposing the truth. As Margaret watered her new roses, she thought about what her husband had always said about justice being like the sunrise. He was right. You couldn't stop it from coming. But what he hadn't mentioned was that sometimes justice needed a little help from a community willing to stand together, a daughter willing to fight against all odds, and an elderly woman who refused to be silenced. The security camera above Johnson's pharmacy still captured footage every day, but now it recorded a different kind of scene. Neighbors helping neighbors, young officers engaging positively with community members, and Margaret Wilson, walking proudly down the street, head held high, showing everyone that age and dignity weren't weaknesses, but sources of unstoppable strength. 1 year after the arrests that shook the police department to its core, Cedar Street was hosting a community celebration. The old Johnson's pharmacy had expanded into a community hub, with a new legal aid office next door, funded by the settlement money from the civil rights lawsuit that Sarah had won against the corrupt officials. Margaret Wilson stood at the podium in front of the gathered crowd, her voice steady and clear. "A year ago, they thought they could break us. They saw gray hair and wrinkles and mistook them for weakness. But they didn't understand what my James always knew, that true strength lives in community, in the bonds between neighbors, in our willingness to stand up for each other." The changes in the neighborhood were visible everywhere. The police department, under Captain Martinez's leadership, had implemented James Wilson's community policing programs that had been shelved years ago. New officers now trained directly with community elders, learning the neighborhood's history and understanding the importance of serving with respect and dignity. Sarah had turned down offers from prestigious law firms in bigger cities, choosing instead to establish a civil rights center in her father's name. The center helped communities across the country fight similar battles against corruption and displacement. The network they'd exposed had turned out to be even larger than initially thought, leading to investigations in 12 different states. But the most significant change wasn't in the policies or programs, it was in the people. Mrs. Thompson from the church choir now walked home from evening services, surrounded by younger neighbors who'd made it their mission to protect their elders. Tom Johnson's security cameras still recorded daily life, but now they captured scenes of officers stopping by to check on elderly residents, carrying groceries, or simply stopping to chat. As Margaret finished her speech, she revealed one final surprise. "Today, I'm proud to announce the James Wilson Memorial Scholarship," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Every year, we'll send 2 young people from our community to law school to continue the fight for justice that my husband started, that my daughter carried forward, and that this community fought so hard to win." The crowd erupted in applause, but few noticed the small smile that passed between Margaret and Sarah. They hadn't told anyone about the letter that had arrived that morning, an invitation to testify before Congress about community policing reform. James Wilson's dream of changing the system from within was finally coming true, though not in the way anyone could have expected. As the celebration continued into the evening, Officer Martinez, now Captain Martinez, approached Margaret with a small package. "We found this in the old records room during the cleanup," she said softly. Inside was James Wilson's original badge, along with a notebook filled with his observations about the corruption he'd been tracking. The final entry, dated just days before his death, read, "They think they can silence the truth, but they don't understand. The truth lives in the community, in our shared stories, in our determination to stand together. One day, it will all come to light." Margaret clutched the notebook to her chest, sharing a knowing look with Sarah. They'd chosen not to reveal everything they'd discovered during the investigation. Some truths were still too dangerous, some battles still needed to be fought. But for now, they had achieved something remarkable, a community that had not only survived but grown stronger through adversity. As the sun set on Cedar Street, casting long shadows across the newly planted gardens and freshly painted storefronts, Margaret Wilson walked home surrounded by neighbors, her daughter by her side. The security cameras above captured this moment too, not as evidence of corruption, but as testimony to the power of resilience, dignity, and the unshakable bonds of community. The story of the elderly lady who stood up to a corrupt system had become more than just a viral video or a legal victory. It had become a blueprint for change, a reminder that justice often comes from unexpected places, and that sometimes the most powerful force for change is simply the courage to stand one's ground, supported by a community that refuses to back down. "Your father would be proud," Margaret whispered to Sarah as they reached their front porch, where James's favorite chair still sat, now surrounded by blooming roses. "Not just of what we accomplished, but of how we did it, with dignity, with purpose, and with love for our community." Sarah squeezed her mother's hand, thinking of the congressional hearing to come and the battles that still lay ahead. "He always said change was like planting a garden," she replied, looking out at their neighborhood, where porch lights were coming on one by one, creating a constellation of hope in the gathering dusk. "You might not see the results right away, but if you tend it with care and patience, something beautiful will grow." 5 years after the events that transformed Cedar Street, Margaret Wilson sat in the front row of a packed auditorium at the newly established Civil Rights Institute. The building stood where an abandoned strip mall once gathered dust. Now it was a beacon of hope and education for communities across the country. Sarah stood at the podium, addressing a graduating class of community organizers and legal advocates. "When my mother walked into Johnson's pharmacy that day, she was just trying to get her heart medication," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "She didn't know she was walking into history. But that's how change often happens. Not through grand plans, but through ordinary people refusing to accept injustice." The Institute had become a model for community empowerment, training local leaders to recognize and fight systemic discrimination. The James Wilson Memorial Scholarship had already sent 10 promising students to law school, creating a new generation of civil rights attorneys committed to serving their communities. Captain Martinez, now Police Commissioner Martinez, had implemented what became known as the Wilson Protocol, a comprehensive reform program that required officers to undergo community integration training with local elders. The program had been so successful that departments across the country were adopting it, leading to significant reductions in police misconduct cases. Tom Johnson had transformed his pharmacy into a community wellness center, combining healthcare services with legal aid resources. The security cameras that had captured the initial incident now served a different purpose: training material for police departments on how not to handle community interactions, and more importantly, how to do it right. But the most profound changes were the quiet ones, the kind that couldn't be captured in statistics or news headlines. Like Mrs. Thompson from the church chore teaching young officers about the neighborhood's history during their community integration walks, or the weekly dinners where residents and police officers shared meals and stories, breaking down barriers that had seemed insurmountable just a few years ago. The congressional testimony Margaret and Sarah had given had led to federal legislation named the Community Dignity Act, requiring transparency in police transfers and establishing strict oversight of property development in vulnerable neighborhoods. The law had already prevented countless attempts at the kind of systematic displacement they'd fought against. Officer Reeves and his conspirators had received substantial prison sentences, but their case had revealed something even more valuable: a pathway to healing the deep wounds between law enforcement and the communities they served. The evidence they gathered had helped other neighborhoods fight similar battles, creating a network of empowered communities standing together against corruption. As Sarah concluded her speech, she shared a recent discovery that brought tears to many eyes. Last month, while renovating the old precinct building, workers found a sealed envelope in my father's old locker. Inside was a letter he'd written just days before his death. She unfolded a worn piece of paper, her hand steady despite the emotion in her voice. "To whoever finds this," she read, "if you're reading these words, then the truth has finally come to light. Remember that change doesn't come from hatred or revenge, but from the courage to stand firm in dignity and the wisdom to build bridges where others see only walls. The badge I wore was never just about enforcing laws. It was about protecting the human dignity in every person I served." Margaret watched her daughter from the audience, thinking about how far they'd come. The neighborhood that corrupt developers had tried to destroy was now thriving. Property values had risen not through displacement, but through community investment and cooperation. The elderly residents who'd been targeted as easy marks had become respected community leaders, their experiences and wisdom helping shape policies that protected vulnerable populations everywhere. The Wilson House had become an unofficial landmark, its front porch a gathering place for community meetings and storytelling sessions. The Rose Garden, once destroyed in an act of intimidation, now bloomed year-round, tended by neighborhood children who learned about civil rights history while planting new bulbs. After the ceremony, as people gathered for refreshments, a young police cadet approached Margaret. "Mrs. Wilson," she said hesitantly, "I grew up watching the video of what happened to you. It's what made me want to become an officer, to be part of the change, not the problem." Margaret took the cadet's hand in both of hers, seeing in her eyes the same idealism that had driven James throughout his career. "The badge is just a symbol," she said softly. "The real authority comes from the trust of your community. My husband understood that, and now, finally, others do too." As the evening drew to a close, Sarah and Margaret walked home together, just as they had countless times over the years. The street lights illuminated a neighborhood transformed not just physically, but spiritually. Neighbors sat on their porches, children played safely in their yards, and officers on patrol stopped to chat with residents they knew by name. "You know what your father would say about all this?" Margaret asked, posing to admire her blooming roses. Sarah smiled, remembering her father's favorite saying. "Justice is like a garden," they recited together. "It needs constant tending, but with care and patience, it will bloom for generations to come." As they reached their front porch, they could see the lights of Johnson's pharmacy glowing in the distance, still standing as a beacon of community resilience. The security camera that had captured their story still recorded daily life on Stater Street, but now it documented something beautiful, a community that had not only survived but thrived, proving that the greatest power for change lies not in force or fear, but in the unshakable dignity of ordinary people standing together for what's right. And somewhere, they both knew, James Wilson was smiling, seeing his life's work finally bearing fruit in ways he could never have imagined, but had always believed possible.